Good morning. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I am Director of Research here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I will be chairing today's seminar. Good morning and welcome. It's a real pleasure for us to host this event for several reasons. First of all, it is a topic of research that is important for us at NUPI. But beyond the research that we conduct here, it is also important in the context of public debates about economic growth and poverty reduction in Africa. There is often a lack of detailed knowledge about the drivers of growth, the composition of growth, and how it will look in the future. To talk about this today, we have several people that have in-depth knowledge about this. We will first have short introductory remarks from State Secretary Morten Høglund from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from Heikki Tuunanen, Executive Director at the African Development Bank. Then Abebe Shimeles, Head of the Research Department of the African Development Bank, will present African Economic Outlook 2015. Then we will have short prepared comments from Arne Melchior from NUPI and Christian Bernau at Spear Capital, and then we will open for discussion. I think I will stop there. I should note that today's event will be streamed online. And with that, I give the floor to State Secretary Morten Høglund. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today at this important event, and a special welcome to our guests from the African Development Bank in Abidjan. Also like to thank NUPI for hosting the event and the Norwegian-African Business Association for its support and collaboration. Against the backdrop of the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals, I welcome this opportunity to exchange views on the economic outlook for Africa and discuss policy implications. First, a few words about the African Development Bank. The bank is one of Norway's close multilateral development partners. It has a strong regional mandate and ownership. Over the last decade, the bank has stepped up its efforts to meet the diverse needs of its African member countries. It continues to focus on key priority areas: infrastructure, private sector development, regional economic integration, and economic governance. Importantly, it has a special focus on the long-term needs of fragile countries, while recognizing the regional dimension of fragility and insecurity. Norway's support for the bank is reflected in our substantial contributions, particularly to the African Development Fund, which provides soft loans and grants to low-income countries. Norway is providing nearly 1.8 billion NOK to the fund for the three-year period 2014 to 2016. I will try to be brief and focus on policy priorities from the perspective of the Norwegian government. The relative importance of ODA is declining. Foreign direct investment and private capital have become much more important for the development of poor countries. Africa today is seeking new partnerships and investments. Still, governments in many African countries have more work to do in terms of creating an enabling environment and conditions for more inclusive growth. Too many Africans have not yet experienced the benefits of high growth figures. Good governance, democratic institutions, and the rule of law are key to fostering inclusive societies and a conducive investment climate. Furthermore, tax spending must enable a positive feedback loop that spurs development and inclusive growth. Partners like the African Development Bank should highlight this in its policy dialogue with African governments. Investment in education and social protection is vital to promote job creation and entrepreneurship for the fast-growing young population in African countries. More needs to be done to ensure women's equal rights and opportunities for participation and leadership in the economy. Given the serious threat of climate change, growth based on clean energy and investment in the transition to a low-carbon infrastructure must be promoted. Governments also need to use public funds more strategically to mobilize finance, including domestic resources and private investment. The Financing for Development Conference in Addis in July agreed on an agenda for action. Renewed ODA commitments, domestic resource mobilization, and curbing illicit financial flows are key elements of the agenda. Norway is fully behind this agenda. The agenda for action also emphasizes private investment and private sector development, trade, and job creation as drivers of economic growth and development. A key question is how development aid can be used more catalytically to leverage finance for development. The private sector is the most important engine for growth and job creation. As many as 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries are in the private sector. A few months ago, the Norwegian government presented a white paper on private sector development in Norwegian development cooperation called Working Together. The government wants to step up its support for private sector development as part of its development cooperation. This requires cooperation at many levels and through a number of channels. Bilaterally, we will intensify efforts through our long-term programs in Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, and Tanzania, as well as in parts of West Africa. Multilateral organizations make a big impact, particularly in creating an enabling environment for businesses and catalyzing finance for investments in infrastructure, including regional projects. A substantial share of Norwegian aid will therefore continue to be channeled through multilateral institutions that demonstrate good results. The potential for synergies between bilateral and multilateral instruments and initiatives should be further explored. Openness to trade is vital for economic success and for improving legal standards. This is why we will use trade as a development policy instrument. In Norway, we have duty for all goods from LDCs and other low-income countries. However, imports from these countries is limited. Aid for trade is necessary to deal with supply-side constraints in the poorest countries. It is important that policy and regulatory systems make it possible for responsible companies to succeed. Norwegian companies have comparative advantages in a number of sectors, in particular energy, fisheries, and companies are known for high standards and responsible business models. The principles of the blue economy model are vital for our own economic development, and there is ongoing cooperation with Norway and African countries in the marine and maritime sectors, both at government level and between private sector actors. So let me conclude. The topic of today's seminar ties in closely with our commitment to leverage finance for development, strengthen systems for national resource mobilization, and promote private sector development in Africa. We should explore potential synergies between the Norwegian business and finance sector and multilateral financial institutions, such as the African Development Bank, with a view to developing initiatives and partnerships that promote responsible development. Overall, as a government, to facilitate such continued consultation with the Norwegian private sector and knowledge institutions will be important in this process. Thank you.
Good morning to everybody, and I would like to immediately thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to see you all here. Yes, my name is Heikki Tuunanen. I'm the Executive Director in the African Development Bank, representing the Nordic countries and India in the Board of Directors. And I want to immediately respond to the State Secretary and saying that, yes, Norway, like other Nordic countries, are very reliable, very generous, and also very demanding members of the bank. We support the bank strongly, but we also have our development thinking, our development agenda. We want bank to also apply those principles which underlies the whole Nordic and Norwegian development policy. Now, I also want to thank Norwegian Foreign Ministry through State Secretary and NUPI for organizing this event today. Needless to say, this is a very timely subject, economic outlook in Africa. It would be very timely, even economic outlook of the whole world, whatever you want to put it. Now, let me just make a few very short comments. First of all, this report, African Economic Outlook, it is a good symbol of the role of the bank. We are the bank, we are a fund, but we are also the knowledge bank. We are the knowledge bank and we are the policy partner for African governments and countries. And this report highlights our role as a knowledge bank. Annually we make our annual report, which is a statutory document from the bank, but that annual report also is a thematic book. And this year that annual report was dealing with the issue of inclusion. And as we all know, it's not only question what's happening in Africa, whether there is growth or how much there is growth and what are the economic outlooks. It's very much question about, is that growth inclusive? Is that grown green? And so on and so on. And then we have also a third annual publication, which is African Development Report. So the bank is a quite strong knowledge bank, quite strong policy partner for African countries when it comes to the issues of development policies on the continent. Now, another point from African Development Bank. What Africa needs many things, but Africa needs strong institutions. And African Development Bank is a strong African institution. This is actually the niche, it's the only niche the bank has. We are not the only bank in the world, we are not maybe the best bank in the world, but we are an African Development Bank for African countries. This is what makes us different and special. And that gives us a very good position in the policy dialogue with African countries, as a knowledge bank for African countries. This bank has no hidden agenda. When we look at Africa from inside Africa, not from outside. And this is important also for our Nordic partners who, like the State Secretary emphasized, who appreciate the role that this bank is representing Africa for African governments. It's a great vehicle for Nordic countries when it comes to the political relations with African countries, because the things that the bank is doing clearly have a kind of also political implications, even if the bank itself says that it's not going to interfere in the political affairs. But that goes back to the 50s and 60s when these institutions were built. There is no such thing as a development without political contents. This bank is a great also partner for us from the development point of view, like it was emphasized. It's an important vehicle to channel aid when we want to invest in Africa's development. And finally, I think this is a very important institution for Nordic countries also from a commercial and economic point of view. Our annual lending combined with other sources when we co-finance is in the region of 15-20 billion. And that's quite a lot of money in African context too. So that makes us a very important, interesting partner for Norwegian businesses and Norwegian who wants to participate in investing in Africa. Now, I think I want to stop here by saying, yeah, this is a very timely report. For decades, it's been discussed whether it's now Africa's time. And now the question is now the Africa's time? Well, I think we can say these times are not given from anywhere. It's an Africa's time if Africa is both able and willing to take its role in the world economy. And this report will a little bit highlight that situation where the bank is at the moment in becoming more important, full-fledged player in the global economy. I just want to finish by saying that, yes, whatever this report says about African economic outlook, I think the key underlying principle is when we look at Africa today, we have to make one special observation. Africa is becoming very diverse. There's no such thing as saying Africa is doing well, Africa is doing badly, Africa is doing average. No. Africa does many things. We have a lot of great success stories, we have a lot of medium success stories, and we have a lot of failures. And that will remain to be so, I think, for years to come. So whatever we read about Africa, whatever we say about Africa, I think the key finding is, what do we talk about? What country? How is it doing? Is it a fragile state? Is it a commodity exporter? Is it a manufacturing country? And so on and so on. So this, I think, is very important, and it's also very important for the Nordic countries like Norway, when thinking, what is the role of the aid? Like the State Secretary was referring to. What is the role of the aid? Do we have some added value in those countries today? When, like countries like Zambia, for example, Ghana, they are collecting from international bond markets 1 billion in 1 week, which is oversubscribed 20 times. You may ask, what is our role? But I think we can turn it upside down. Maybe today, when African countries, many of African countries have more resources, they are more able to do the right things, they are more able to invest in development, maybe this means that this is the better time and the best time for development cooperation as well. Because we can complement and put our efforts in those critical areas where we can cooperate with our African partners. So this whole issue of the role of aid is a very timely issue, as we all know, but I think we also have to look at it from the different angles. So with these few words, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give the floor to my management colleagues from the bank who will represent the report. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick.
Good morning. We are very pleased and honored to be invited by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. For the first time, actually, in the bank's history, we've been able to touch base with the Nordic countries, starting with Oslo. And we thank, of course, the State Secretary and my ED for their earlier remarks. My name is Abebe Shimeles. I'm very familiar with the Nordic states. I studied in Sweden and live in Finland. So it's very good to come back to second home. I'm a director of research in the African Development Bank, but have worked for almost 30 years in development, poverty reduction, inequality are the passions of my research. Today, I'm very happy to represent the bank and share one of our flagship publications, the African Economic Outlook. In the research department, we have 4 annual reports. You can see the heavy load that we are lifting. The African Development Report, currently the theme is poverty, actually overcoming the barriers. Is growth making any difference on people's lives? And what is the underlying drivers of inequality in Africa? As the Secretary mentioned, actually, you'll be surprised, as poor Africa may be, it's also one of the most unequal continents in the whole developing regions. All the statistics point to that. And that is very much worrying, given the weak institutions and the weak political will. Therefore, development is essentially also impeded by the extent of widespread inequality in Africa. So in that report this year, we highlighted this phenomena. And this one also we are highlighting spatial inclusion, which is essence of most of the inequality in Africa. This report is prepared jointly with the UNDP partners for the last 15 years. We are very grateful for the contribution of the European Union, which started actually this project. And today, this report covers 54 African countries. which are 54 anyway. So we write current state of affairs, economic, social, political, and we do forecasts for 54 of African countries, including Somalia. You'll be surprised. So this is a very rich resource for the private sector, politicians, and everyone. So with this, but also we have the main report, which is covering 8 chapters. What I try to do here is in 10 minutes, just give you the main messages of the report and invite you to read the rest. And hopefully the Norwegian Institute continues to invite us every year so that we share our findings on this one. Okay, I'm trying to just, okay. In this report, we just cover a macroeconomic forecast of the African economies. As Edie said, Africa, 54 countries, macrosome of all these different countries. Some are sliding back, some are doing very well, some years they do well, some years they really disappoint you. There is pockets of conflict, there is macroeconomic instability. So we cover all this in our narrative in these chapters. But then every year we pick up a topic of importance. This year, especially inclusion in Africa. So I will not take you much of your time on how Africa is doing currently in terms of its economic prospect. I can summarize it in 3 sentences. It may be doing very well compared to other developing regions, but when you consider overcomes poverty and future population growth, the 5% that we have been seeing, the average GDP growth rate will not be sufficient. Currently, we are also facing headwinds. The global economy, as you know, is slowing down. Europe is not growing, which is a major trading partner of Africa. And of course, China is transiting from consumption, from investment exports sector to economy to consumption and services. So this transition, some even say current growth in 4%, not the 6% people talk. And then the moment the devaluation of the yuan has happened, it has enormous implication on several African countries. More than 20 African countries have, for instance, a trade partnership with China of more than 10%. This is completely different from the 90s, where almost it was 0. So a lot of countries are going to be affected. So we try to look at the implications. For Africa, the big picture is, of course, it's growing on the average at a rate of 4 to 5% per annum, the GDP growth rate. Particularly sub-Saharan Africa is doing well. North Africa, when you account for Libya or other countries, then suddenly you find the growth story to slow down. So these are some of the numbers we have. We can come back in the Q&A sessions because I want to just quickly go into the thematic part, which is of interest to this audience. The regional growth prospects, 6 out of 10 today, the fastest growing are in Africa, 6 of the 10. But this doesn't mean those countries are really making headways in terms of poverty reduction and human development. We'll come back to that as well in the few slides. The key drivers of growth in Africa are very well known. Of course, agriculture is a major component of our employment in Africa. So weak agriculture is always a reason behind low economic growth. But then we have currently picking up investments in construction. Some commodity booms for the extractive sectors have improved Africa's prospect. So the question whether is it Africa's time it remains to be doubtful still, even though we have had all these opportunities, good commodity prices, etc. So in this report, we caution the optimism with a lot of risks that the continent is going to face. You know, Africa has lots of pockets of conflict. There is terrorism, human smuggling. migration, illicit financial outflows, lower commodity prices. When all this combines, they create a storm. Actually, we wrote a brief recently, the storm. On human development, the report outlines the performance of Africa. Of course, there are differences by regions, but overall, Africa has been improving its HDI, partly thanks to also the MDGs, which helped galvanize countries to invest more on human development. So we hope the SDGs, again, energize countries. So the special team, I'll just give you 3-4 slides, and then I'll stop so that you have more time to intervene. Africa in the next 35 years. We are trying to take and sit and then say our next generation, what is their fate? Will they be sharing the same fate that we've done? Are we inheriting poverty, or are we to our generation another gruesome life, or there is hope? So in this report, we have been bold and very straightforward. We have identified opportunities, we have identified challenges in the next 35 years. So all these issues come out in this report. When you look at the demographic picture of Africa, as most of you by now know, the continent's population is really rising at an alarming rate. So when you make the 35 years projection, Africa will be the most and also the youngest all over the world, while even China, India tend to age. Of course, Europe started aging, even the US. So in 35 years, you will be seeing a huge amount of people populating Africa. So look at this map. This is Africa in 2050 in terms of its population. So it's getting really, if you look at the western and eastern part of Africa, the size is really emerging at an astronomical rate. Southern Africa and Northern Africa are shrinking. But then you compare it with GDP per capita, you see a very sick and sleeky Africa. And in comparison, places like these ones, Eastern and West, in terms of population, they are nearly explosion, but in terms of GDP, is shrinking. So this is a scenario. A lot of discussion has gone, as you know, how to transform African economies. People talk about industrialization, people talk about transformation, people talk about governance, etc. And our bank has been investing hugely in the last 10 years on developing infrastructure. Now, some of the research we've done in this report also shows some caution that infrastructure is not the answer to everything. Actually, this is a very good example from Kenya, where the north. Look at this map. It shows accessibility to the nearest town, to the population. So the blue one and the deep blue one shows you the most inaccessible part. It takes you more hours to reach the next town. The red ones are more accessible, have less than 2 hours trip to the next city, public services, etc. But if you look at 2 towns, Nakuru North and Nyando, the per capita GDP between these 2 cities, which have the same infrastructure facilities, is almost one is 3-4 times richer than the other one. So there are elements beyond infrastructure that are very, very important for African countries to take into account. We can come back in the discussion how this features in the development debate. So the question is, how do we create 29 million new jobs in 2030? Is this public sector? Is it natural resource based? So in this report, what we try to do is really challenge policy, the enormity of the problem, but also development partners. The usual thinking may not work. We need a very holistic approach, regional planning. Countries need cross-border projects. Countries need Africa regional trade. Countries need security across all borders. Countries need political stability. So these questions for Africa are not simply a matter of choosing which policy is important. I think is important. Without security, political stability, and strong, so of course, countries cannot survive and thrive. So in this report, we take the approach beyond the national borders. And then institutions such as ours need to step up and talk directly to the policymakers what is at stake. So with this, I will just wind up the discussion. We try to say a new paradigm of regional development. We outline in this report several recommendations, and I invite you to read this report. But then we can come back in the Q&A if necessary for more. Thank you for your time. Yeah, it's better.
Okay. We try to, I prepared a couple of slides, so we'll get the screen down again and the slides on. In the meantime, I will just say thanks for the invitations to hold this brief comment. It will be a kind of bird's eye perspective. I'm not a kind of specialized on Africa. So, but it was a very enriching experience to read the report. It's a great study encompassing a lot of aspects of the African development. So I accepted to hold a comment to learn about Africa. So, I will start by putting Africa a bit into a kind of global perspective, because the challenges of Africa are not special to Africa only. So I'll say a couple of things about Africa on as a commodity producer in the global economy. So there it's going. So we'll see. So yes. So this. Okay. Yes. So this is a kind of trade portrait of the major world regions: Europe, mainly Western Europe and Central Asia, Pacific, North America, Middle East, Latin America, former Soviet area, and Africa. So, based on a couple of publications I made in recent years. So it's not fully up to date. It's until 2010. So it takes a bit of work to construct this global database. So that's why it's not fully updated, but it covers a long period from 1970 to 2010, and this is for 2010, a kind of snapshot. So you will see that the giant traders of the world are Asia, Pacific, and Europe, with about a third of world trade. Then North America is also a kind of industrialized region with a high percent of manufacturing in exports, but spatially more excluded, so the percentage of world trade is lower. Whereas you have these four commodity-based regions, the Middle East, Latin America, former Soviet area, and Africa, with a relatively low share of world trade, a very low share of manufacturing in their exports, and a very low share of intra-regional trade in their total trade. So in a sense, the intra-regional trade is more leaning towards manufacturing. So this is the kind of grand picture. So, of course, these regions, they are small in world trade, but they grew fast over the decade after 2000, after the turn of the century, and this was partly commodity driven. So, if you look at Africa's share of world trade in this graph, it decomposes it into intra-African trade, the lower blue line. So you see it's very low. It increased to 0.4% of world trade in 2010. And this Africa's share of world trade dropped continuously in the so-called lost decades, but picked up in the last decade after 2000. So there was significant growth. So the big issue for Africa and for the former Soviet area and for Latin America and for the Middle East is, of course, will this continue? And most likely the answer is no, because it was partly, at least partly, driven by the commodity prices and the commodity boom. So what is the percentage? That is really a big issue for Africa, and it's a big issue for the other regions, because they're kind of struggling to diversify, upgrading skills, and this pattern picture is a bit mixed. So from what I had time to read in the report, this is a kind of mixed picture, because some commodity-producing countries in Africa sustain growth more than you might expect if it was only driven by commodities. And you had the kind of human capital upgrading in Africa, which is a contribution to permanent growth. So it's not only commodities. So this is a very crucial piece for Africa, but also for the world economy, because all these four major commodity-leaning regions are kind of struggling with some of the same issues. So they all have this challenge of diversification. Should they make manufacturing, etc.? And you saw from this last slide that the share of manufacturing in export is pretty low, and the share of intra-regional trade is low. So some of the kind of typical engines for Western Europe and Asia, intra-regional integration, goods trade, don't work so easily for the. So you can try it in the Soviet space, and you try it with the Eurasian Economic Union, but it doesn't work so well because of the low economic density. So this is related to this spatial perspective that you have in the study. So what is special about the commodity regions is also that if you cannot do manufacturing, you have to do more services. So, and of course, agriculture is also very important for some of these regions. It's, especially the former Soviet area, agricultural development is crucial. And for Africa, agriculture is important. And this is emphasized in the report. In addition, I would like to emphasize services, which is also, of course, mentioned in your study. But it's very important that services is a huge part of the global value chains. And for example, you don't have to, if you don't make cars, you can still transport cars. If you look to Norway. So we didn't make many cars in Norway, but we have transported a lot of cars. So to participate in the global value chains, supplying services is very important for the more commodity-leaning countries. And then there is the importance, if you're going to produce services, you need governance, you need infrastructure. The internet must work for the banks, and there must be reliability, etc. And of course, Africa has a lot of challenges in spots and areas with less stability, etc. But this is quite important. As a kind of digression here, I would also mention a couple of Norwegian stories about Africa. For example, we had this import of flowers from Kenya to Norway, which is one of the success stories of trade preferences. So we made a study a few years ago where we found that the price was multiplied by 4 on the way to Norway. So we were a bit puzzled. What was this? So now we are making another study. The results will come next year. What is this quadrupling? Where did the money go? Is it an error in the statistics? Or is it traders in Netherlands? Or is it transport costs? So we are working on it. The transport costs are huge, and the role of middleman is large. Maybe special for Norway as a kind of small and peripheral nation. Another kind of Norwegian story digression is meat, where Norway had kind of substantial preferences for especially Botswana and Namibia. Big quota for beef, which is prohibited from the rest, except for a small quota which is auctioned to Latin America, etc. But Africa has 3 times more, but there is a huge price gap between Africa and Norway. So what happens in between the Norwegian price level and the export price level? This is really a big puzzling story, interesting story. So we are making that story too. So next year we'll make a study on this, what happens with this price gap, what happened in Namibia and so on. So about the spatial inequality, you could kind of decompose the total inequality in the world in international inequality between countries, if everybody in each country had the same level, the regional inequality within countries, and then the interpersonal inequality within the regions. Then there is the rural-urban dimension, which is kind of overlapping because one region can have many big cities and other. So some in China say, oh, it's only the rural-urban, but then it's also the regional because there are many more cities in some region. So Africa's pattern is, of course, that the international component is huge because Africa is poor. Only one high-income or country is that right? Yes. And and the regional dimension, which is studied here, is intermediate. For example, in the United States, you have very high inequality, but you have very low regional inequality. So whereas in China and India, the regional component between the states or districts is a kind of large component of total inequality. So this is interesting to study because it tells you about policies. If regions are well integrated, so the regional dimension is unimportant, other policies are necessary. So I think the study makes a valuable contribution to this. And my impression from earlier studies is that the interpersonal component is varying a lot between countries. So certainly there is this variation, diversity. So about some questions about this inequality in Africa. To put it kind of in an extreme fashion, so will least developed countries and low-income countries disappear from the world map? Let's hope so. And in fact, if you look at this one, so if this trend from the decade after 2000, if it continued, it would almost be the case. So in a couple of decades, the number of low-income countries would kind of drop very much. The least developed countries, they are, there is this institutional debates and about graduation and who should be dropped from the list, but many countries would have to be dropped from the list. So now with the falling commodity prices, we have to wait a bit longer for this kind of a strong decline in the list of the poor countries. But it's a kind of very important, in the longer run, it's a very important question for Africa. Should you fight for the preferences of the poor, or what will happen when the LDC list is only 15 countries, when the low-income group is very small, because that was about to happen in this growing decade. And it has a considerable implication for international politics, because Africa has been kind of leaning a lot towards this differential treatment of countries, although the aid dependency is going down, as the report depicts the trend. Yes, on the regional inequality, I didn't have time to really study all the details, but my impression is that Africa replicates, at least for a number of countries, what we can see in Central Europe, where the capital city regions are kind of dominating. So a lot of the growth is happening in some limited areas. I did a study on Europe and European regions and their development, and I didn't have an explanation at hand. But one possible explanation was the kind of institutional heritage from the communist era, so that you have to know people in the capital. So you cannot trade with your neighbors in the periphery. So it creates this kind of hub and spoke pattern, which is a complex phenomenon, but it's a kind of important for the regional policies of a country. Is it because of infrastructure? I mean, in Russia, you built roads to Moscow. So one explanation is that all the infrastructure is kind of creating this capital city pattern. Other possibility is the institutional explanation, that there is something about governance, that you have to know the people in the capital, and you cannot trade with your neighbors. So, so that's an issue. I will end by asking a kind of the same question about the world trade system. So because I'm working a lot on trade. So Africa, many small nations in the economic scene, they have a strong interest in the multilateral system. So the EU can negotiate agreements with all the ACP countries. But Norway will have a big job to grapple with all the 200 countries of the world. And the lowest on the list are the smaller countries and the poorer countries. So free trade agreements expanding very fast, but it's middle income, high income dominating. And you have the new challenge of the megalaterals, where the TPP agreed yesterday. So the question is, what should Africa do here? So I think Africa, together with Norway, has a very strong interest in the world trade system, but I would say that the preferentialism of the WTO has been kind of created among some of the participants, a more of a mixed feeling. So in the tariff liberalization in NABA, 100 countries were exempted. And some African countries, they were, at least at the start of the Doha, complaining more about the preference erosion than about the gains for their neighbor countries. So I think for Africa, it's important to have growth in the big countries and not only the weakest. So for example, we extended our preferences so that not only Tanzania had 0 tariffs for flour, but Kenya had. I think that was a good thing, but Tanzania lost a bit. But on the whole, this was very good. So this is an aspect. So I think I've talked long enough. I finished there.
Well, thank you for the interesting presentations. My name is Christian Victor Bernau, and I'm the managing partner of Spear Capital. Spear Capital is a private equity company primarily backed by Norwegian investors, and we are investing in small and medium-sized enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa. We have offices in Cape Town, Harare, and in Oslo. And so far we have invested in 2 companies in Zimbabwe, the largest wholesale company, and the second largest dairy in Zimbabwe. 2015 revenues for the 2 companies will be around $300 million, which is about 2% of official Zimbabwean GDP. With the unofficial, it will probably be 1%. Both companies have been profitable, and they are profitable and have a profitable growth, and it's been growing by 140% during the last 2 years. There was a question how to create 29 million new jobs per year. We estimate that about 150,000 people in Zimbabwe are dependent on our investments. That's more than 1% of everyone living in Zimbabwe, and that's up from about 50,000 at the time when we invested. Spear Capital's mandate is to invest all over sub-Saharan Africa. We have a special focus on South Africa, on Zimbabwe and Zambia. We're also investing in Rwanda, Uganda, and in Zambia. So that was the marketing of Spear. I have a few questions. Do you want me to just ask one question at a time and then get answer for that? It was mentioned that the Ghana bonds were, I don't know, you said that, 20 times oversubscribed. This financing is much needed for the infrastructure projects that will foster, the growth, development, everything. Many African nations are approaching deficits or having fiscal deficits. What is the African Development Bank's view on the various African governments' appetite for bond financing going forward?
Maybe you can say save the answers for the Q&A in
Okay.
the panel, so you do
Should
your
just-
questions and then we collect them.
Okay. That was a long question. I don't know if you remember that. You also mentioned the commodity price downfall, and in addition to the currency tumble against the US. How, in your view, will this impact the fast-moving consumer goods sector and the growth of the SME companies or enterprises? That's where we invest. That is so important for the growth of the African middle class. The third question I'd like to get an answer to is that we see that the interest and the willingness of investing into Africa is huge. We also see that the American pension funds, they are investing. But you're always investing in the huge funds. And the huge funds, they can only, you know, the ticket size is much larger than really what is needed in sub-Saharan Africa. What we see where the companies that need the money the most is, you know, in the segment where we invest between $2 and $10 million, because that's where you see the growth of the African middle class. I'm just asking, you know, the capital for that segment is very limited, and also if you are so lucky you can get equity financing, that's fine, but you also need some of that with debt financing. With the high interest rates, we see that our portfolio companies, you know, they lend at about 16 to 18%, which is killing the business. What can the African Development Bank do about that, and how can you easily facilitate loans and it's not taking such a long time from when you apply to when you get the money? That's sorry about that, but that's the questions that I have. Thank you.
Could you please join Høglund and Anna? Ja, så bra. Ja. You can use that if you please. Four. Okay, thank you first of all for excellent presentations and for good comments and questions now towards the end. May I ask that you perhaps start by addressing some of the questions to your operations and to the report, obviously, both of you, also Høglund, and then we open up for comments and questions from the audience. So.
Thank you very much. Actually, the comment from our discussant is very intriguing. The idea that the report projects a bit of a pessimist view is not unrealistic when you sit and think about the enormous challenges the continent has, and also the fragility of growth, especially when you go study country by country the growth performance. Very few countries have had a sustained growth without having cyclical effects, because sometimes negative growth do not affect symmetrically as positive growth. Some shocks keep people for a very, very long time in poverty, into economic distress, because we don't have the necessary social protection programs in Africa and many places. If a business, for instance, survives one episode and then faces a problem next time, they just simply wipe them out. So to restart the whole thing requires a lot of support from other sources. But I fully agree with your observation. Very insightful, actually. Probably just to assist you on the decomposition of the inequality in Africa, what we have done within Africa itself, between countries, inequality varies significantly. Just to give you an example, wealth inequality. In Egypt, it may be much better in terms of access to electricity, access to sanitation, access to a better housing. The Gini coefficient for assets in Egypt is around 8%. But then take it to another place like even my own country, Ethiopia, or in the southern parts, South Africa, Botswana, you will find the Gini coefficient close to 60%. That is enormous gap in between countries. And the most important is the urban, rural, and the periphery center components. That's why we coined this spatial inequality. Now, on the world trade system, etc., I think you have nailed a very important issue. We have not done much study what the future would look like if Africa countries are not paying attention to the emerging trading blocks around the world. I would not comment on AGOA and other free trade agreements. We have not been exploiting them as much as we should have done. I think this is obvious. I've been to places like, for instance, one of the countries, Lesotho, who started a manufacturing hub in the 90s to benefit from the US free trade agreement, ended up handing over the benefits to China because it was Chinese companies who came there, ran the whole thing and put the label made in Lesotho, and then took the money out of the country. Nothing happened actually. When you go now and visit Lesotho, all the textile firms are gone. They are not anymore there. Even China left. So there is a discordance in the policy architecture in many African countries. Now coming back to our colleague's question from the private sector, let me start from the last question. The African Development Bank has a window for the private sector. I don't know how much you know about it. We fund about $1 to $2 billion for small scale and medium-term enterprises, both equity financing. Sometimes I'm not sure about the debt financing, but I can check for you. I think we have been granting a lot of support, but also what we call additionality. We guarantee also the loan requests. Say if a small enterprise comes to the bank and would like to raise from the capital market loans, we provide guarantees to the third party. So this has worked very well, and I think many private sector operators tapped into the African Development Bank's private sector window. On the oversubscription of sovereign bonds in Africa, it has to do with the global saving glut. In Europe, for instance, if you want to keep your money, you get 0 interest rate. If you want to take a bit of risk in Africa, you get 6-7%. Why not then buy Ghanaian bonds? So that's why this flood of oversubscription is happening. But the question on the physical sustainability of this bonanza, this opportunity, the bank has done a lot of debt sustainability studies to many countries, including Ghana. Actually, Ghana was the first to make a distress call to the African Development Bank because they suddenly found themselves in a corner. They discovered oil. They came to Norway, studied how Norway managed to use its natural resources. They got the advice, and then they increased 25% of wages for all the public sector, and then the politicians promised heaven for everyone. In 2-3 years, suddenly Ghana had no resources, and IMF came and then told them to slash all their wage increases, freeze spending, otherwise there would be no funding available. So they came to the bank, and the bank simply agreed with the IMF's recommendation. Ghana is another example of, I think, policy distortion in managing simple resources such as wells created from the ground. Zambia, I think, managed to contain the temptation, but still they have some physical crisis. My colleague Anthony is from Zambia, so he can tell you a bit the story. And we were asked also to review the macroeconomic situation for Zambia because currently they are facing a huge fiscal crisis because copper is now almost a free commodity. It has fallen to such an extent nobody wants to buy it. So Zambia is really in a big fix. This is, for instance, a typical example of relying on a few commodities for a nation to finance its development. I hope this is enough.
Yes, well, thank you. Just very few comments. I think what was said by Arne Melchior on the trade perspectives, it's very interesting and crucial. And now we have the first ministerial meeting of the WTO taking place in Africa in December. And unfortunately, I think it will be a lost opportunity. Not because it's Nairobi, but because of international atmosphere on trade negotiations. We have to think post-Nairobi. But the whole thinking and the example you mentioned that we started giving also preferential treatment, or we have Kenya along with Tanzania, and that you can have regional motors in the drive. I think that kind of thinking and promote inter-regional trade, cooperation across border. Just some days ago, I was in Angola, and the most positive thing I took from Angola was in the meeting with the Ministry of Energy, and now they are looking at the electrical grid system, connecting Angola with Namibia, with Zambia, with Congo. And of course, we know that getting power, electricity out is crucial for investment, for business, but that you can connect across board and you get the actual cooperation taking place, which makes it possible to build that kind of lines. And you can, it brings together a cooperative spirit, which in itself is also positive on a crucial part of infrastructure.
Thank you. Arne, Christian, do you want to have brief comments to the questions, not the answers, or should we move on to the audience? Do you have any?
I can say one sentence.
Okay.
So the one sentence is to the last comment by Mr. Høglund. I agree that to think of growth poles is quite important. So not only to support the poor. For example, in Africa, I think the fate of South Africa is very crucial to sub-Saharan Africa generally. So we have to think what can we do, in a sense, to make South Africa grow, and not only those around. So that's important to think in growth.
So
maybe while colleagues think about questions, I'm sorry to come in, because what the secretary mentioned about these cross-border huge infrastructure projects are actually the basis, if you will, for Africa's future. Look at the security problems we have within the borders. A very good example is East Africa, which is a hotbed of conflicts. Now Ethiopia is trying to sell power to Kenya. So Kenya will not finance insurgencies if they want to maintain power continuity. Sudan is buying from Ethiopia. Djibouti is buying. I think this regional project from the Ethiopia's perspective has been mainly for security as well as also development. Look at now the Congo project. It is, if completed, recently the bank is at the forefront of making what we call the New Deal on energy in Africa. The Congo has the potential to power the whole of Africa with all its industrial capabilities. I mean, it's a huge hydropower electricity project. So South Africa is now in Congo making sure this will happen. But what happens is Congo will be also peaceful, because all countries bordering Congo, Angola, etc., will have a stake in making Congo, which, as you know, is one of the richest places. It's the Amazon of Africa. If you have not visited Congo and you want to understand why Africa has a problem, visit Congo. I invite you. You find everything there. You just sit there and really feel like crying. Why is this continent so needy? When you see Congo, they have timbers, they have logs, they have gold, they have diamonds, they have the soil, even the chips, the potatoes that they produce in Congo is the best in the world. If you have never tried it, you don't need all these things the companies put. It's so natural and extremely tasty. And the continent is suffering, Congo. So I think this is a very good example you have mentioned.
So I have a gentleman in the back there, and then there. Please identify yourselves, please.
Thank you very much. Paul Arne Davidsen, Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. I have a question to the State Secretary. In 2012, February, Arne Melchior here in the panel co-authored a NUPI report looking into the GSP system. So my question is very brief. What can we expect from the government tomorrow?
Well,
So, should we collect a few questions, maybe? You can.
or I can take this one very quickly.
Okay. Okay. Let's have another one, and then. Yeah.
Well, I'd also like an answer to that, actually, by the way. Hello, my name is Johan Hermstad. I'm the director at the Norwegian Council for Africa. Now, as we know, sort of on the basis of the studies by, for instance, Pritchett and Roderick and these guys, growth accelerations like of the type that Africa has been experiencing the last decades is hard to sustain over time, and one of the challenges would be to sort of move into the kind of value-added activities where you have a lot of also total factor productivity rises, right? So, which is typically not something that you would find in resource extracting economies. So sort of a natural thing to expect would be to diversify economies into the type of activities that are typically mentioned as typical manufacturing activities, right? But I don't know if any of the panelists are familiar with the recent work of Danny Roderick. He did a working paper this January on premature industrialization, where he sort of is really quite pessimistic when it comes to the role of manufacturing today. I mean, where you have more of a larger disconnection between sort of the typical high labor-intensive manufacturers and the link from this to sort of the parts of the value chain where you have a lot of knowledge-intensive activities and technology and so on. So sort of a comment on Roderick is obviously very, very pessimistic, perhaps overly pessimistic regarding the prospects of manufacturing in, for instance, Africa. And he's also super negative or pessimistic on the role of services, where you also see typically that the sectoral specialization of Africa is not in typical sectors where you have a lot of total factor productivity rises. So where do we look going forward, and not least, what kind of industrial policy do we need, for instance, in order to not see the example of Lesotho, where you have a lot of foreign direct investments that are there for a while, but also vulnerable if there is no national policy to sort of to cradle or to keep the sector in place.
Well, as the experienced questionnaire will know, I'm not going to comment on a budget will be presented tomorrow. No, it's always a risk having this kind of seminar or any seminar just a day before the budget is coming. But I would also just say that we have presented also a paper to Parliament now on trade policy, which we have invited Parliament to discuss this issue and other trade-related issues in a comprehensive way in Parliament. So we are looking forward to how the Parliament will react and give guidance on future policy directions on these issues.
Yes. Well, I have not read the latest Rodrik's paper, but I can guess from my readings of his previous work on Africa's future. He tends to be very cautious about African renaissance and its fate in the world economic world. What I can say, I think, just to help this discussion, his concern arises out of the fact that Africa is still using its natural resources as a base to launch industrial development, whereas in Asia, for instance, where there was nothing in the 50s, they just somehow had to leverage every opportunity, aid, and Cold War, whatever you call it, and then invested in education of their people to transform their economies. Where Africa is still sleeping is on education, in my view. Actually, we are sleeping down the road. When you look at the quality of education, the spread of education, I didn't mention it in our study of inequality. One of the drivers is differences in the level of education. When it comes to industries, there are bright spots. I think maybe Rodrik has to pay attention to. The Kenya, for instance, the mobile banking, how it's transformed lives shows you African innovation. And if you watch CNN sometimes also, they have a lot of startups with African manufacturing bases all over the place. Another is Ethiopia, a country I know at least quite well because I'm from there. I'm just telling you, despite all the problems you hear, the seed for manufacturing in Ethiopia is emerging. You may be surprised if that country remains peaceful the next 10 years. It will be a manufacturing hub. You will not believe, for instance, the shoe industry processes, the leather industry processing, the textiles, the flowers, and all, they are just happening there. Morocco, they're providing now spare parts to Boeing, no, Airbus, the auto industry, the IT industry, Tunisia again. Those countries, if they manage their political transition, they are investing a lot in the value chains of different sectors. Even Rwanda is emerging. So I can give several examples where seeds of industrial ambition is happening. Now the question is, will Africa have the will? I don't think either me or Rodrik will be able to answer this, because development sometimes is random and it can surprise you either pleasantly or disappoint you badly. Thanks.
Okay, just a brief comment on services and the policy implication. We made another study actually about 5 years ago about the possibility of starting with trade preferences in services. So a kind of GSP for services, or like we have zero tariffs for the least developed countries. So we were kind of the conclusion was a bit mixed, because this has obtained a kind of symbolic value at the WTO. So many poor countries say this is important, and I think it's played a role in negotiations. But I think that we concluded in a sense that that services are heterogeneous. So some services, like financial services, are very skill-based. So they will not be exported in huge amounts from Lesotho. So to give Lesotho trade preferences for financial services may have a symbolic value, but will not lead to great trades. So we said that unless the West is willing to open up on mode 4, which is related to migration, which is of course much more controversial, this is a kind of mixed bag. You kind of creating expectations that are difficult to fulfill. But I think it's important to notice that services is a kind of heterogeneous mix. So some are skill-based and others are not so skill-based. And for example, tourism is an important sector for many African countries, and but perhaps not so. I mean, trade barriers are perhaps less crucial for tourism than for, let's say, financial services. Yes.
I just because it's not so well known that we just this year we gave a waiver on services to LDCs, and that means that all the least developed countries will be getting the same level of access to the Norwegian market as we have in the best free trade agreement, which is today with Ukraine. So how much it will be, they will be able to use it, but that we hope that it will generate something, and if we can, and if we get some going, others will hopefully follow.
In the back there, and then yeah.
My name is Nils Restad, Bridge Consult. Why does it take so long for multi-development finance projects to get off the ground? It's a subjective view, but it seems to me that you pay more attention to NGOs in Europe and America, you know, looking at environmental. Maybe there is a rodent that's living right there, so in the end, after 10 years, you shut down the project. Take an example in Uganda, where the Chinese built a road down to Lake Albert, where the Congolese refugees could not get their fish to market. Now they have a road through environmentally sensitive areas, but it's saving a lot of lives. So to me, pay less attention to all the people in the West, listen to the NGOs in Africa, and get some projects going faster.
Sorry, yes. Thank you very much to all the panelists for very interesting introductions. My name is Frederick Arthur. I'm Senior Advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also Ambassador for Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And that's the capacity and the reason why I'm here and why I want to ask the bank in particular a question. A couple of years ago, the World Bank launched one of its flagship reports dedicated in its entirety to gender. And one of the very clear and explicit conclusions drawn by that flagship report was that investing in women's empowerment, women's economic empowerment, was probably one of the best investments one could do. And it was phrased as smart economics, which we use, of course, whenever we have the opportunity. And since the bank's report this time is very much focused on inclusion, I'd like to ask the bank what are your views on the economic empowerment of women in Africa and their role in the future development of African economy? And I ask you this also because we've seen examples under the auspices of UNCTAD, where women have been given incentives as entrepreneurs and where the results are highly successful. Thank you.
My name is Thomas Haug, and I'm with the Norwegian Council for Africa. I have a question concerning the statistics on service sector, which Abebe mentioned. Recently, there was the report from World Economic Forum on Africa competitiveness report, and it was interesting for me there to read about this same tendency, and actually they even suggested that because people, the increase in service sector employment, it might even suggest that could Africa skip the industrialization level and go straight for service and then develop through that. So I would be very interesting to ask Abebe and any other in the panel would comment. Does the African Development Bank support this view? How much do you think there is to it? That's my first question. And second question, yeah, well, my second question would be, what do you think would be the reasons for why we see this tendency? Melchior did some comment on it, and he said that it might be, if I understood you right, that we see this tendency because there are no other opportunities. So do you think that when maybe there will be more opportunities for manufacturing, then we won't see this tendency, or it won't be that important? Thank you.
Okay, I can start. I think my executive director may have to answer to that. Maybe he will come to your question, because they are the ones who sit and decide on bank operations, and they voice, of course, the concerns of NGOs, their government, and also the development community about the sensitivities of some projects to environment, to displacement of people, to indigenous people. I don't know. There are so many complicated issues. In the research department, we have no really much knowledge about operations, but I hope my colleagues will help in that. And it's a bit political as well. The gender issue on economic reports that we produce here, the African Development Report, the one we have just finalized, actually has a full chapter dedicated to gender issues. And even this year, we have gone beyond the traditional discussion about gender inequality. Oftentimes, the hidden discrimination that people talk about and the traditional allocation of responsibilities, by picking up a very controversial issue, domestic violence. Actually, we were very much surprised the magnitude of domestic violence in Africa. We looked at the demographic and health surveys, and we found actually African men are the most violent in terms of inflicting both verbal and physical and sexual abuses on their women. That is even self-reported, imagine. And so many underreported cases also happen. So what we have done is do a very good economic analysis of this domestic violence. Not only is it a social issue, it's also an economic issue. We were able to find women who experience domestic violence actually give birth to children with low weight, which has permanent damage to the children who grow up under this condition. So in that report, we called it this domestic violence a double break on future generations. Not only it affects, so it's about 40%. So literally every woman, 50% of women in Africa experience domestic violence, especially in rural areas, and more so repeated violence, and that has impact on economic activities. So this is where we try to flag the issue of, because it goes all the way to the economic and social relationships. So I hope we'll be able to send that report to you, and probably you get more interesting information. On the debate between smokestacks and without smokestacks, whether we should skip the industrialization and land into Apple and Microsoft world for Africa, I don't know the source of this debate. I have done a bit on industrialization in Africa. We have now 2 books coming out with Brookings Institution and UN Wider. We studied about 16 countries, why they are not industrializing. And then we have tried to identify the areas of policy intervention that requires for this industrialization to kick off. I think the first is one should not really make this distinction. Both can happen in the same place. Like it happened in Kenya, for instance. The services sector in the mobile banking, etc., the innovation, all those things are happening while Kenya is also a manufacturing hub. What most people do not know probably is that Kenya is not an agricultural economy. It's a manufacturing and services economy. Share of GDP in Kenya for agriculture is less than 20%. I mean, close to any middle income country, even lower than Tunisia. Most people think Tunisia is advanced desert, but the share of agriculture is very high in Tunisian economy, even compared to Kenya. So my belief is, I think this debate between skipping the industrialization thing has come when China became the factory of the world. So there is no job for Africans at the time. But now look, China is also transiting, and it's becoming expensive to produce in China. Even China is exporting its factories to Africa. Most of the new factories in Ethiopia that were built in the last 5 years came from China. So I think it's a debate a bit very skeptical and too, in my view, reductionist, and doesn't take into account a lot of other issues. So thank you.
Yeah. Can I just say a few words about the question of the consultant? Actually, that question it goes straight to the owners of the bank, not not to the board only. Now this is a very important issue. What is this bank? We are a bank, but we are also a development bank. When we invest in development, we want to invest in development in a sustainable way, in an inclusive way, in our safeguard systems, which actually puts all the criteria to our all activities. We even introduced, very much thanks to our Nordic chair, in the last round, we introduced the issue of human rights. The bank, whatever the bank does, it must be based on the recognition and promotion of human rights, including minorities and so on. But your question is very pertinent in a sense that when we spoke about these bonds, many African countries, they're collecting money from international markets with the interest rate of 6–7%, while the bank would give the same money for 2–3%. But we still have sometimes difficulties in marketing our services for many African countries. Why? I must say, partly for the reasons you mentioned. We are small, but unfortunately we are a bit clumsy. It can easily take 1 year, 2 years to process the project and the loan agreements and so on and so on. If you are a finance minister in a country X, you want the money to build a road. You go to the investors. Can you build the road? Can you give us the money? Okay, give us the money, we build it. And they already built it while we are still going through our safeguard systems. What's happening on this area? Is it okay from environmental point of view and so on and so on. But as I said, yes, we are not bank, we are development bank who have certain principles and criteria, and we will stick to those. But your question is very pertinent, and our new president, one of his first observations in the first board meetings was, we cannot continue business as usual. We must be small and fast. We cannot just take endless time in processing slowly like a civil servant, our applications and so on. We have to adapt to the modern world. And this, I think, is important, and I hope, and I think the bank will do it. Just another point, if I have a flaw. When we spoke about the manufacturing in Africa and so on, and somebody mentioned China. Okay, China is, 20 million jobs are leaving China in the next 10 years. 20 million jobs, because China is going higher on the production ladder. Are those jobs coming to Africa? Not necessarily, but they can come. They can come if Africa can serve the circumstances for investors to come to Africa. And quite frankly, I think if you look at the success stories of the Asian tigers from 60s, 70s, 80s, what happened? Very simple thing happened. They realized the new division of labor in the world markets. And what happened in Asian tigers? They created only three things. They created infrastructure. They educated people for basic skills. And then comes the tricky one. They were able to maintain political and economic stability. Forget about democracy, something like that. No, but they were able to create stability. No, as a Nordic ED, democracy is our first priority. But what I'm saying, the Asian countries, they were able at that time to seize the opportunities of the changing global division of labor. Stability, infrastructure, people. But I think we still can rely on those same principles. If Africa is able to increase stability, to put its abundant labor force on a bit better shape, and the difficult one, to create infrastructure, then only the sky is the limit. There's no such thing as investments going to that part of the world or that part of the world. We are living totally in the markets of the investors. They go where they get the best treatment. And if Africa gives the best treatment, they all go to Africa. It's simple as that. It's difficult to do it, but the principle, to my understanding, is still very simple. And this gives a great opportunities for Africa, provided African governments are politically willing and able to put the things right. Thank you.
Thank you. This is just an addition to what Abebe said regarding the importance of gender in economic empowerment for Africa. I think just to underpin the bank's recognition of the significance of gender, the president, the immediate past president, did create an independent office of the special envoy on gender to basically champion the importance of gender in the bank's operations, at mainstream gender in the bank's operations. So that just goes to underscore how important we take the issue of gender at the highest level. I just thought I should add that to the point that Abebe raised. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one. You will get a chance to, have concluding remarks. I have one very brief comment, and that it concerns what I take to be a very important bullet point in your presentation, concerning the importance of tailor-made responses and policies. Now, to me, at least as far as I know, with regards to the World Bank, but I think it's the same for the African Development Bank, that you allocate funds on the basis of performance and needs, but there is the performance-based allocation system. Now, that system presumes that what works in country A also works in country B, because you measure them by the same standard, correct? And the better you score, the more money you get. That seems to be in contradiction with the idea of having tailor-made policies to specific contexts or countries. So if you could comment on that, if there are discussions about this within the African Development Bank, that would be great. I also wanted to ask Christian to offer very briefly your reflections on how, well, seen from your perspective, here at NUPI we get researchers come all the time to give presentations, and policymakers like today, we have statistics, etc. That gives you one element of the social reality that we want to understand better. And we have had some of that here today. But when you look at it from your perspective as an investor, what are the key factors that you look for, and what is it that is missing from your experience when working in Africa? Thank you. So maybe you could all, if you have comments, we'll just go through, and then we conclude, because we're running a little bit over time. Thank you.
So I start with your comment. I think when we say tailor-made and the allocation rule we use, it's called CPIA, right, Anthony? The policy, it starts with C. What's C? CPI.
Country policy institutional assessment. Yeah.
Institutional assessment. Thank you. He knows our bank very well. You know, this indicator has had its own internal discussion. We have been asked in the research department to comment to what extent it serves as a good mechanism for resource allocation. The policy parameters we take in those are so general and sometimes so commonsensical, like stability, for instance, corruption, quality of bureaucracy, good governance. It's like, you know, indicators to identify a good country. Necessarily, the specific policies you need to promote development doesn't mean you require weak institutions. You need strong institutions in any context. You need a less corrupt government in any context. So they are really pillars for a modern society. So the policy indicators, we have found them actually more stringent. And a lot of African countries have been moving at a snail pace on the policy dimension. That means it's also ranking, you know, from 1 to 5 or something. So they just move very, very slowly on these areas. What we are talking here is when you want ambitious development policy program, then you have to think outside the box. That's where I think the comment earlier on Roderick's work, which he said, you know, forget about this multilateral economic fundamentalism. The market will take care of itself. In most African countries now, when you go, they are advised to liberalize markets. They are advised to privatize parastatals. They are advised to help the market operate. But oftentimes the market is also tricky. It's also a world of crooks and a lot of corruption underlying it. We have done a very extensive study on market power and market distortion in Africa. You'll be surprised. A simple thing like fertilizer. Norway is a major exporter of fertilizer to Africa. We've looked at the pricing of fertilizer simply across African countries after addressing what we call the fair cost. Say, importing it from Norway all the way to Africa, there is a cost to be paid for shipment, insurance, and then ground transport, and then some profit for people who do the business. And still you get a huge price gap between Norway's price and what the farmers pay at the gate. Usually this is because there is a collusion within oligopolic power within African countries. So in the CPIA, it's really about fairness, and that doesn't have to be specific to each country. Fairness is fairness, corruption is corruption. So I think on that note, I would be concluding just this presentation by thanking, of course, the host and the secretary for his valuable time to be with us. It's a great honor for the African Development Bank. But also we hope as you will continue to host this debate every year. We are willing to come. If you invite us, we'll be happy to come. And thank you for the audience, for your time, for your questions. And please read the report.
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you from my side. It's been very, very useful, interesting. And I think this is something we will follow with a great of interest forward. And I think what you said in the beginning, that to look at Africa, you have to look at, or which Africa are you talking about? And there is one general comment about Africa will necessarily not fit. Yes. It's a lot of different snapshots and pictures taking place.
You asked about what we're looking for in companies that we invest in. I mean, there are so many fantastic opportunities in Africa. Mm-hmm. And we also see that when you say something about manufacturing, we see You know, the people, they want to invest in the most, you know, the best equipment. Just spent some time in Rwanda. You know, they just invested $25 million into, you know, recycling paper. They're making, you know, toilet paper. They're making detergents. We have dairy in Zimbabwe, in Kwekwe, which has the latest Tetra Pak equipment. We're increasing from 1 to 3 shifts. You know, they're just wanting to invest. They want to invest in the best equipment. And they're good people. We're looking at the wholesale business that we have in Zimbabwe. I used to work for a wholesale company here in Norway, and we had 4% loss. We have 0.4% loss in Zimbabwe and 1,000 employees, no ghost workers. We're looking at one, I have difficulties pronouncing them, polythene bags, is that how PP bags, that's how I pronounce it, but yeah. In Uganda, they just invested $8 million into German equipment to make these bags. The market for those bags are 4 million bags a month. They cannot produce enough. They want to do this, they work hard, you know, they're really good businessmen, but you have to give them the trust, and you can't come as a European investor and say, we know the market, we know your country, and we know your product better than you. What we can say is that we can help you. We can help you become better. We can be your partner. We can be your speaking partner. And if we see that in the management, and we see there's a great business idea, then we're willing to work with them. Because we don't want to come them and tell them exactly what to do. We want to help them to become better at what they're doing. And we see that all across Africa. I just, I spend about 20 weeks of every year in Africa, traveling around looking for opportunities. And I see this willingness to invest in great equipment, willingness to be superior at what they're doing, to produce good things. And like we never look at anything on the IFC exclusion list, of course, but there's so many opportunities, and we don't look at anything that's got any red tape or you need licenses or anything. We go for the fast-moving consumer goods and we invest between $2 and $10 million into the companies. But when they get the money, they got such a huge competitive advantage. Metro Commodities in Zimbabwe had $82 million in revenues when we invested. This year, they're going to have $240 million. And they've been profitable all the way. They're growing market share. They're doing the right things. We're employing people. We're increasing in the dairy, the 3 shifts. We're going to have about 1,000 employees within 18 to 20 months. We're looking at other opportunities. But the limiting factor has been electricity. You know, in Kwekwe, you know, the grid in Zimbabwe, it's even in Harare, it's off 80% of the time now. And you're from Zambia, you see the drought in Zambia, and the copper prices, you know, and the electricity crisis. Even in Cape Town, down in Waterfront, you know, it was closed down because there was no power. That's a really difficult thing. And then the company that we're looking to invest in Rwanda, they don't have access to water. So they have to drill borehole like 5 kilometers away. And we need to get assurance that they have 100% uptime on the grid, because otherwise we can't produce the things. That's the problem. That's the infrastructure problem that you have to address. And that's why I was so worried about, you know, with the commodities prices going down, you know, China and all that, and how you can assist in that. And if those things were in place, and without those things, if I had $100 million, I could invest in 10 to 15 to 20 extremely profitable and nice business, and they will grow tremendously as soon as they get the cash, because that's the scarce resource. It's not the knowledge that we bring to the table; it's the cash. And if they have the infrastructure in place, you know, this continent, you know, the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they will, you know, benefit tremendous. So that's, and I also think that, well, you addressed it yourself, it takes a long time from when you apply to when you get the funding. It's actually time to act now, not to wait. It's just like the internet period in 2000. It's not to make the right decision, make a decision. And if I can only, for one thing, if I can beg from, you know, the initiatives that we have here in Norway with Norfund and all that, that's great initiatives. But also if you can you don't have to access, you don't have to give the money to the governments. You can give it to, for example, Spear Capital, and we can invest it. I mean, if we grow 100,000 jobs by investing $11 million into Zimbabwe, imagine what we can do with 100 or $200 million.
Okay. So I think you said in your presentation that everything is important, and it is true. And there are many of them have been covered in the study and in the comments. So, but I would like in the final comment to lift up the kind of special theme of the report, which I think is very timely to kind of raise the awareness about spatial economics and inclusion. And I think, for example, on Africa, there is tremendous evidence, for example, that landlockedness is a big thing. It's very important if you're landlocked or not. It applies within countries and across countries. And if you look at South America with the jungle and mountains in the middle, if you look at the Soviet space with the plains and low economic density, I mean, if you look at Africa with Sahara and a big economic space, it's kind of difficult to say what can be done about it. But it's very important for economic development, and to understand it better is quite important for economic policies. And in the report you have mentioning the corridors, the cross-border cooperation, the trade integration, etc., which are remedies. So to understand better how this can be handled is quite important for Africa and for other continents. So it's been very nice to take part and learn more about Africa. So thank you very much.
I want to thank the participants, in particular State Secretary Høglund, Abebe, and colleagues from the World Bank, and the Executive Director from the African Development Bank for the presentation and for discussion, and for all of you for coming. Thank you so much.